Hello dear friends, and welcome to Edward's Sleep Mysteries. I'm Edward, and I'm glad you've chosen to spend these quiet moments with me. Before we begin, take a moment to notice the evening around you. The stillness, the soft sounds, the way the day slowly fades. If you feel like sharing, tell me in the comments what helps you relax most at this hour. If you enjoy these gentle stories, you're warmly invited to subscribe. Now, make yourself comfortable and let the night unfold. Chapter 1. A Morning That Began Too Quietly. There are mornings in the life of every small English town when the world arranges itself with such familiar precision that one might set a pocket watch by the sequence of sounds that greet the waking day. First comes the distant crow of a cockerel, then the careful tread of the milkman's cart upon the cobblestones, followed in short order by the opening of shutters, the calling of children's voices, and, in towns blessed with a church of any consequence, the sonorous declaration of bells announcing that the Sabbath, or some festival of particular note, has arrived to claim its proper recognition. Such had been the pattern of Christmas mornings in Ashwick Green for as long as the oldest inhabitants could remember, and memory in that place extended backward through generations with remarkable consistency. Ashwick Green was a town of modest pretensions and comfortable habits, situated in that pleasant region of England where the landscape rolls gently without disturbing the digestion, and where the church spire rises just high enough to be seen from the surrounding farms without suggesting any unseemly aspiration toward grandeur. The houses were constructed of warm grey stone that took on a honeyed glow in summer and a dignified solemnity in winter. The high street contained all the establishments necessary to civilised life. A baker whose bread arrived warm each morning, a draper whose windows displayed fabrics of such respectable quality as would neither embarrass the wearer nor excite envy, a public house where conversation flowed with the same steady reliability as the ale, and a post office presided over by a woman whose knowledge of local affairs was so comprehensive that the official delivery of letters seemed almost superfluous to her intelligence-gathering operations. At the heart of the town stood the church of St. Barnabas, a structure of no particular architectural distinction but possessed of that quality of patient endurance that inspires more lasting affection than mere beauty ever could. Its stones had weathered 3 centuries of English seasons, its pews had accommodated countless generations of worshippers, and its bells, when rung, produced a sound that entered the chest and settled there with all the warmth of a familiar greeting. It was upon this Christmas morning in a year not long past that the inhabitants of Ashwick Green woke to find that the accustomed order of things had been subtly but unmistakably disrupted. The cockerel crowed as expected. The milkman made his rounds with his usual punctuality. Shutters opened, and here and there a child's voice proclaimed the arrival of the blessed day with appropriate enthusiasm. But the bells of St. Barnabas remained silent. At first, the silence went unremarked. Mrs. Margaret Ellaway, whose handsome residence occupied the prime position on Church Lane, attended to her morning preparations with the methodical grace that had made her the model of domestic excellence throughout the town. She had risen early, as was her custom on Christmas morning, to ensure that every detail of the day's celebrations would unfold with proper dignity. The goose had been ordered from the most reliable source. The table linen had been laundered to such a degree of whiteness as to suggest that cleanliness might indeed be considered a theological virtue. The silver had been polished until it reflected not merely light, but the very soul of household order. As she moved through her preparations, Mrs. Ellaway listened with half an ear for the bells that would summon the town to morning service, but her attention was so thoroughly engaged by immediate concerns that their continued absence failed to register as anything more than a vague postponement. In a cottage near the edge of the churchyard, Mr. Jonathan Reed completed his own morning rituals with the quiet efficiency that characterised all his actions. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, though his face possessed that ageless quality common to those whose features have never been dramatically arranged by strong passions. His hair had greyed early and uniformly, giving him an appearance of mild distinction without vanity. His eyes were grey as well, of that particular English grey that suggests clouds without threatening rain. His clothing was invariably neat, invariably modest, and invariably appropriate to his station as caretaker of the church grounds, and general overseer of those small but necessary tasks that keep a parish functioning smoothly. Mr. Rees. Reed had lived in Ashwick Green for the better part of his adult life, having arrived in his youth under circumstances that were now largely forgotten by all save himself. He occupied a position that was neither exalted nor insignificant, being rather of that useful middle rank that observes much and says little. His duties encompassed the sweeping of walks, the trimming of hedges, the lighting of lamps, and the general maintenance of that pleasant order which allows others to pursue their lives without troubling themselves over the mechanisms by which orderliness is achieved. He was known to be reliable, courteous, and remarkably unassuming. Indeed, his capacity for self-effacement was so complete that many of the townspeople would have struggled to describe his features with any precision, though they encountered him nearly every day. On this Christmas morning, Mr. Reed rose at his accustomed hour, washed in cold water that he heated only slightly, for he held the opinion that excessive comfort weakened both character and constitution, and dressed with the careful attention to propriety that marked all his actions. He then walked the short distance to the church, his breath visible in the cold morning air, his boots making small crunching sounds upon the frost-whitened path. He carried with him a ring of keys, for among his duties was the unlocking of various doors and the ensuring that the church building stood ready to receive its congregation. As he approached the stone edifice, he paused for a moment to observe the quality of the morning light upon the ancient walls. It was a habit of his to notice such things, though he never spoke of these observations to others. He found in the play of light and shadow, in the way frost clung to certain stones and not to others, in the particular angle at which winter sun illuminated the stained glass windows, a source of quiet satisfaction that required no audience. He unlocked the side door and entered the church. The interior was cold and dim, smelling of old wood and stone, and the lingering trace of incense from previous services. He moved through the space with the confidence of long familiarity, lighting candles, arranging hymn books, checking that the heating stove had been properly prepared. His movements were deliberate but not slow, efficient but not hurried. He possessed that rare quality of being entirely present in his work without appearing to labour at it. From the bell tower above, the great bells hung silent in their wooden frame. Mr. Reed glanced upward once, his expression unreadable, and then continued with his preparations. By the time the Reverend Thomas Glynn arrived at the church, walking briskly from the vicarage with his vestments folded carefully under his arm, several other early arrivals had already gathered in the churchyard. They stood in small clusters, speaking in the subdued tones appropriate to the season and the location, though there was about their conversation an undertone of something not quite like concern but rather like puzzlement. The Reverend Glynn was a man of middle age and gentle disposition, whose natural inclination toward peace had been strengthened by his theological training into something approaching a philosophy of life. He believed firmly that most difficulties resolved themselves if one exercised sufficient patience, and that harmony was best preserved by avoiding unnecessary disturbance. His sermons were notable for their soothing quality rather than their rhetorical force, and his parishioners valued him precisely because he could be relied upon not to discomfort them with excessive demands upon either their consciences or their pocketbooks. As he greeted the assembled parishioners with his customary warmth, someone ventured to observe that the bells had not yet rung. The Reverend smiled with easy confidence and suggested that there was time yet before the service commenced. Perhaps Mr. Reed had been delayed by some small matter. Perhaps the frost had affected the mechanism. Perhaps, and here he chuckled softly, the bells themselves were observing a moment of reverent silence before proclaiming the joyful day. The small joke was received with polite laughter, and the conversation moved on to other topics. Yet as more parishioners arrived and the appointed hour of service drew near, the continued silence of the bells became increasingly difficult to ignore. It hung in the cold air like a question that no one quite knew how to ask. A presence made all the more noticeable by its very absence. Mr. Reed appeared periodically, attending to various small tasks with his usual quiet competence. When Mrs. Ellaway, who had arrived in a state of magnificent preparation that suggested Christmas morning, it was a military campaign requiring meticulous planning, inquired about the bells, he offered a mild reassurance. They would ring when they ought to, he said gently. It was not perhaps the answer she had expected, but there was something in his tone, in the calm certainty of his manner, that discouraged further questioning. Mrs. Ellaway turned her attention to greeting other arrivals and ensuring that her own family was properly arranged for the procession into the church. The service began without the bells. The Reverend Glynn conducted the proceedings with his accustomed grace, and the congregation sang the familiar hymns with appropriate feeling. Yet throughout the morning, beneath the sacred rituals and the warm greetings and the general atmosphere of Christmas celebration, there persisted a curious awareness of what had not occurred. The silence that should have been broken remained unbroken. The sound that should have called them to worship had never come. And in that silence, though none of them recognized it yet, lay the seed of something that would require answering. Chapter 2. The Sound That Did Not Come. The progression of Christmas morning in Ashwick Green followed its customary course in all particulars save one, and it was precisely this singular omission that began to exert upon the consciousness of the townspeople an influence quite disproportionate to what might have been expected from so seemingly minor a deviation from tradition. The service concluded with the usual benediction. The congregation emerged into the cold brightness of the morning with their spirits appropriately elevated by sacred observance and the prospect of festive meals awaiting them at home. Children ran ahead of their parents with that particular variety of restrained exuberance that suggested they had been reminded, multiple times and with increasing firmness, that Christmas Day was still the Sabbath and required appropriate decorum. The older parishioners lingered to exchange greetings and to comment upon the excellence of the Reverend Glynn's sermon, which had touched upon themes of peace and goodwill with such gentle insistence that no one could possibly have taken offence. And yet beneath these familiar rituals there persisted an awareness of what had not occurred. The bells had remained silent. The sound that should have filled the morning air, calling the faithful to worship and announcing to the wider countryside that Ashwick Green was properly observing the holy day, had simply not come. It was as though a sentence had been spoken with one crucial word omitted, leaving the meaning intact but the rhythm disturbingly incomplete. Mrs. Ellaway, who had positioned herself near the church gate in order to receive and distribute greetings with maximum efficiency, found her attention repeatedly drawn to the bell tower. She was not a woman given to fanciful thoughts, having long ago determined that practicality served one better than imagination in the management of a household and the maintenance of social standing, yet she could not quite shake the peculiar sensation that something expected had been withheld. When her sister, Mrs. Henrietta Bramley, remarked upon the unusual quiet of the morning, Mrs. Ellaway responded with a brisk dismissal of the concern. Perhaps the mechanism required attention, she suggested. Perhaps the weather had affected the workings in some way that would be easily remedied. Perhaps there had been a misunderstanding about responsibilities. She spoke with the confidence of one who believed that all difficulties could be resolved through proper organisation and clear communication. Her sister, a woman of more anxious temperament, was not so easily reassured. She recalled that the bells had rung without fail for as long as she could remember, through snow and rain, through the coldest winters and the warmest summers, through times of celebration and times of sorrow. Their silence seemed to her an omen of some sort, though she could not have said what sort of omen it might be. Mrs. Ellaway regarded her sister with the patient exasperation of one who has spent a lifetime attempting to inject reason into a constitution naturally inclined toward worry. There was nothing ominous about a mechanical difficulty, she declared firmly. The bells were simply bells. They would ring again when the matter was attended to, yet even as she spoke these sensible words, Mrs. Ellaway found her gaze returning to the tower, and to the figure of Mr. Reed, who could be seen moving about the churchyard with his customary quiet efficiency. Mr. Reed had become, by degrees so subtle as to be nearly imperceptible, the object of mild curiosity among the departing congregation. He was observed going about his usual tasks, gathering discarded service sheets that had been dropped by careless hands, straightening a bench that had been shifted slightly askew, checking that the gate latch was properly secured. His movements displayed no urgency, no concern, no awareness that anything might be amiss. Indeed, his very composure seemed almost studied, as though he were deliberately projecting an air of normalcy to counter the growing unease of those around him. Young Mr. William Thatcher, whose family occupied one of the larger farms on the outskirts of town, and who possessed that combination of energy and limited discretion common to men of 25 years, approached Mr. Reed directly, with the question that others had hesitated to ask. "The bells," he said without preamble. "Why did they not ring this morning?" Mr. Reed paused in his work and regarded the young man with an expression of such mild attention that it might have been mistaken for incomprehension. Then he smiled, a small, patient smile that contained no discernible emotion beyond gentle acknowledgement. "They will ring when they ought to," he replied, his voice carrying that quality of soft certainty that discouraged further inquiry while offering no actual information. Mr. Thatcher, not satisfied with this, response, but uncertain how to press the matter, without appearing rude, tried another approach. Was there some difficulty with the mechanism? Should he fetch someone to examine it? His father employed a man quite skilled in the repair of such things. Mr. Reed thanked him for his concern with perfect courtesy, and assured him that all necessary attention would be given to the matter. There was no need to trouble anyone on Christmas Day. These things had a way of resolving themselves when the proper time arrived. The young man retreated, more puzzled than he had been before the conversation, and related the exchange to his family with the air of one who had attempted a straightforward mission, and somehow found himself navigating a labyrinth. His mother, a sensible woman who prided herself on not borrowing trouble, suggested that Mr. Reed undoubtedly knew his own business, and that they would all do well to attend to their own celebrations, rather than fretting over matters that did not concern them. Yet the conversation, and others like it, spread through the departing congregation like ripples across still water. Each person who inquired received a similar response from Mr. Reed, calm, courteous, and fundamentally unsatisfying. The bells would ring when they ought to. All necessary attention would be given. There was no cause for alarm. It was precisely this studied reassurance, this persistent tranquillity in the face of an obvious anomaly, that began to transform mild curiosity into something approaching genuine interest. Human nature being what it is, we are far more intrigued by questions that are deflected than by those that are directly answered. A mechanical failure once explained becomes merely tedious. A mystery, however slight, invites speculation. By the time the last of the parishioners had departed for their homes, leaving the churchyard once again to its customary quiet, the silence of the bells had become a topic of general discussion. In parlours, where families gathered for their Christmas dinners, the matter was raised with varying degrees of concern. The older residents recalled previous occasions when the bells had failed to ring and attempted to remember how those situations had been resolved. The younger ones, for whom the bells had been an unchanging feature of every Christmas morning in their memory, found their absence more disturbing than their elders did, for they had never known a time when such reliability could not be assumed. The Reverend Glynn, dining with his wife in the modest comfort of the vicarage, addressed the matter with his characteristic optimism. Mr. Reed was a most reliable man, he observed. If there had been any true cause for concern, he would surely have raised it. The silence of the bells was regrettable, certainly, but hardly catastrophic. They would ring for the evening service, no doubt, and all would be as it should be. His wife, who possessed a more practical turn of mind than her husband, wondered aloud whether Mr. Reed might benefit from some assistance with the bells. They were quite large, after all, and required considerable strength to manage. Perhaps the man was simply finding the task more difficult with advancing age. The Reverend considered this possibility and dismissed it gently. Mr. Reed was hardly elderly, and he had never given any indication that his duties were beyond his capacity. Still, the Reverend made a mental note to speak with him privately, to ensure that all was well, and to offer whatever support might be needed. In his cottage by the churchyard, Mr. Reed sat at his small table and ate his Christmas dinner in solitude. It was a modest meal, but adequate to his needs. Bread, cheese, a portion of cold meat purchased from the butcher the previous day, and an apple saved from his autumn stores. He ate slowly, methodically, his thoughts appearing to occupy some distant realm quite separate from the simple actions of sustenance. When he finished, he washed his plate and cup with careful attention, dried them, and returned them to their proper places. Then he put on his coat and walked back to the church. The afternoon light was already beginning to fade, taking on that particular golden quality that winter afternoons possess, as though the sun, conscious of its brief tenure in the sky, attempts to compress all its warmth and beauty into a few precious hours. Mr. Reed unlocked the church once more and climbed the narrow stairs to the bell tower. The great bells hung in their frame, silent and massive, their bronze surfaces catching the light from the small window. He stood before them for a long moment, his expression unreadable, his hand resting lightly on the rope that would, if pulled, set them swinging and fill the air with their ancient voice. He did not pull the rope. Instead, he turned and descended the stairs, locking the tower door behind him with the same deliberate care he applied to all his tasks. The bells of St. Barnabas would remain silent through the evening service as well, and the silence would deepen from a curiosity into a question that demanded answering. Chapter 3. Doors opened without greeting. The peculiar quality of that Christmas afternoon in Ashwick Green might best be described as one of muted expectation, as though the entire town had collectively drawn breath and now waited, without quite knowing what it waited for, to exhale. The families who had gathered for their festive meals found their conversations drifting with surprising regularity toward the subject of the silent bells. Even those households where such matters were typically dismissed as trivial discovered that the absence of an expected sound possessed a curious weight, occupying mental space that might otherwise have been devoted to more immediate concerns. As the short winter day progressed toward its early conclusion, the inhabitants of Ashwick Green began to emerge from their homes for that traditional Christmas afternoon promenade, which served the dual purpose of displaying one's finest seasonal attire and working off the effects of excessive dinner. The high street, which in the morning had been largely deserted save for those proceeding to church, now filled with families moving at that leisurely pace which suggested no particular destination beyond the demonstration of continued animation after substantial eating. What struck the more observant among the townspeople was how subdued these greetings had become. Where normally Christmas afternoon would have been marked by loud hailings across the street, by jovial exchanges and hearty laughter, there now prevailed a curious restraint. Neighbours who encountered one another spoke in tones barely above conversation, as though some unspoken agreement had been reached that loud voices might disturb something fragile in the atmosphere. Even the children, normally liberated by the day's special dispensation from their usual constraints, seemed to moderate their volume, casting occasional glances toward the church spire, as if uncertain whether their joy might be considered inappropriate. Mrs. Ellaway, walking with her sister and her own grown daughter, Miss Amelia Ellaway, found herself paradoxically annoyed by this very circumspection. She had spent the better part of the dinner declaring that the matter of the bells was of no consequence whatsoever, and yet here was the entire town behaving as though some tragedy had occurred. She made a point of greeting her acquaintances with particular vigour, determined to demonstrate that at least one household in Ashwick Green maintained proper Christmas spirits. Her daughter, however, possessed a more sensitive temperament than her mother, and she noticed what Mrs. Ellaway, in her determination to project normalcy, had overlooked. The older residents of the town were not merely walking for exercise or display. They were gravitating by seemingly casual routes toward the vicinity of the church. They would pause near the gate or linger by the wall, engaged in conversation that appeared innocent enough but which kept their attention oriented toward the building and its grounds. Miss Amelia observed this phenomenon with growing interest. She was a young woman of 28, unmarried by choice rather than circumstance, possessed of a keen intelligence that found limited outlet in the social expectations of her station. She had long since learned to entertain herself through careful observation of human behaviour, and what she observed this afternoon struck her as decidedly peculiar. Mr. Reed was visible, as he had been throughout the day, attending to various tasks about the churchyard. He moved among the graves with his habitual quiet efficiency, straightening a wreath here, clearing frost-damaged foliage there, his presence so constant and unremarkable that he might have been mistaken for a permanent feature of the landscape. Yet Miss Amelia noticed that he was being watched. Not openly, not with obvious scrutiny, but with that sidelong attention people employ when they wish to observe without appearing to do so. She drew her mother's attention to this fact, speaking in an undertone so as not to be overheard by the other promenaders. Mrs. Ellaway, glancing about with the sharp eye of one who prided herself on missing nothing of social significance, was forced to concede that her daughter was correct. There was indeed something peculiar in the way people positioned themselves, in the way conversation seemed to ebb and flow with Mr. Reed's movements. Mrs. Bramley, who had been listening to this exchange, with the concentrated attention she brought out to all potentially interesting information, ventured to observe that Mr. Reed had been caretaker of the church grounds for a considerable time. Surely, she suggested hesitantly, he would know something about the bells, about who had rung them previously, about what arrangements had been made. The question hung in the cold air, and for a moment the three women regarded one another with that look of shared recognition that passes between individuals who have simultaneously arrived at the same conclusion. They did not know, any of them, who had rung the bells in years past. They could not recall, despite their collective decades of residence in Ashwick Green, when the current arrangements had been established, or by whom. This realization proved more unsettling than the silence of the bells themselves. It suggested a gap in the continuous narrative of town life, a chapter that had somehow been skipped or forgotten. Mrs. Ellaway, who maintained detailed knowledge of every significant event in Ashwick Green dating back to her childhood, found this absence in her own memory deeply disconcerting. Other fragments of half-remembered information began to surface as the afternoon progressed, and various groups converged in their wanderings. Old Mr. Pemberton, whose mind was generally considered unreliable on matters of recent occurrence, but remarkably sharp regarding events of decades past, mentioned that there had once been a man whose specific duty was the ringing of the bells. Not Mr. Reed, someone else. Someone who had lived in a small cottage that had since been converted to other use. When pressed for details, Mr. Pemberton grew vague. It had been some years ago, he thought. There had been some difficulty, some change in arrangements. He could not quite recall the specifics, but he remembered there had been talk, considerable talk for a time. This information, imprecise as it was, circulated among the promenaders with surprising speed. It acquired details and embellishments in the telling, as information inevitably does when passed from one person to another. Some claimed to recall the bell ringer distinctly, though their descriptions of him varied so wildly as to suggest they might be remembering different individuals entirely. Others insisted that the bells had always been Mr. Reed's responsibility, that there had never been a separate bell ringer, that Mr. Pemberton's memory was conflating different periods and different people. Young Mr. Thatcher, encountering Miss Clara Bennet near the churchyard gate, attempted to impress her with his earlier conversation with Mr. Reed. Mr. Bennet, whose family had lived in Ashwick Green for only 7 years, and who therefore regarded herself as still learning the town's peculiar history, listened with flattering attention. She was a young woman of pleasant appearance and modest fortune, generally well regarded for her gentle manner and practical sense. She ventured to suggest that perhaps someone should simply ask Mr. Reed directly about the history of the bells. Surely if anyone knew the full story, it would be him. Mr. Thatcher, recalling the studied evasiveness of his morning inquiry, was less confident. There was something in Mr. Reed's manner, he explained, that discouraged direct questioning. Not rudeness, certainly. Nothing so definable as obstruction. Rather a quality of gentle deflection that left one feeling that to press further would be to commit some subtle breach of manners. Miss Bennet considered this observation with thoughtful attention. She had noticed Mr. Reed many times in her years in Ashwick Green, but had never truly observed him, if the distinction might be understood. He was simply there, a fixture as permanent and unremarkable as the church itself. Yet now, Watching him move about the grounds with his unhurried grace, she found herself wondering what thoughts occupied his mind, what knowledge resided behind that mild, patient exterior. The afternoon light began its gentle fade toward evening. The promenaders, having circled and recircled the same paths, having exchanged the same fragments of uncertain memory and unconvincing explanation, gradually dispersed toward their homes. The evening service would begin in 2 hours, and there were preparations to be made, appearances to be maintained, the comfortable rituals of Christmas Day to be completed. Yet as they departed, many cast a final glance toward the bell tower, where the great bells remained as silent as they had been since dawn, and more than one person found themselves troubled by questions they could not quite articulate, questions about memory and change, about what is preserved and what is quietly set aside, about the difference between forgetting and choosing not to remember. Mr. Reed, alone once more in the churchyard as the last of the promenaders departed, stood for a long moment looking up at the tower. The expression on his face was impossible to read from any distance, but had anyone been close enough to observe him, they might have seen something that resembled neither satisfaction nor regret, but rather that peculiar quality of patient resolution that belongs to those who have set themselves to wait for something they know must eventually arrive. He turned and walked slowly back to his cottage, his footsteps leaving shallow impressions in the frost that had never fully melted despite the brief appearance of afternoon sun. Behind him, the church stood silent, its tower dark against the deepening sky, its bells as mute as stone. Chapter 4. Questions left in the cold air. The evening service at St. Barnabas proceeded under circumstances that might charitably be described as unusual, and less charitably as decidedly awkward. The congregation assembled with rather more punctuality than was their custom, as though uncertain what might occur if they arrived at the appointed hour and found themselves alone. The church filled with that particular quality of suppressed curiosity that characterizes gatherings where everyone is conscious that something irregular is afoot, but no one wishes to be the first to acknowledge it openly. The Reverend Glynn conducted the service with his habitual gentle authority, though those who knew him well might have detected a certain deliberateness in his manner, as though he were navigating terrain that required more careful attention than usual. His sermon, which touched upon the theme of patience in times of uncertainty, was delivered with perhaps more emphasis than strictly necessary, suggesting that he too had become aware of the growing unease among his parishioners and sought to address it through spiritual instruction rather than direct acknowledgement. Mr. Reed attended the service as he always did, seated in the back pew nearest the door, a position that allowed him to slip out quietly should any matter require his attention. He sang the hymns in a soft voice that blended into the general harmony without distinguishing itself. He bowed his head during prayers with appropriate reverence. He departed, as he always did, before the final hymn had concluded, to ensure that the doors would be opened wide for the congregation's exit, and still the bells remained silent. It was after this second service, as the congregation emerged into the cold darkness of Christmas evening, that the restraint which had characterized the day's earlier conversations began to fray at its edges. The accumulation of small puzzlements, of questions deflected and memories found wanting had created a collective frustration that sought outlet in increasingly direct inquiry. Mrs. Ellaway, whose natural authority in matters of social organisation had been somewhat undermined by her inability to explain the day's central mystery, decided that the situation required leadership. She positioned herself near the church gate where departing parishioners would be obliged to pass and announced in tones that carried admirably through the cold air that surely someone must know something definite about the bells and their history. This pronouncement was met with a murmur of agreement from those within hearing, and soon a small assembly had formed, drawn by that magnetic quality possessed by any gathering that promises revelation, or at least collective commiseration. Mrs. Bramley contributed her nervous speculation. Young Mr. Thatcher offered his observations of Mr. Reed's evasive responses. Miss Amelia Ellaway, whose afternoon observations had left her with more questions than answers, wondered aloud whether there might be some record in the church archives that would clarify matters. It was at this juncture that the Reverend Glynn, who had lingered in conversation with several elderly parishioners, joined the group and found himself the immediate focus of attention. Surely Mrs. Ellaway suggested with that particular firmness that made her suggestion very nearly indistinguishable from commands, the Reverend would be able to provide some insight into the arrangements regarding the bells. The Reverend, caught somewhat off guard by this direct appeal, temporised with the skill of one long practised in pastoral diplomacy. The bells, he observed, were indeed an important part of the Church's tradition. Their silence today had been noted certainly. As to the specific history of their management, he confessed that his own knowledge was perhaps less comprehensive than might be desired. The arrangements had been in place when he arrived at St. Barnabas some 12 years prior, and he had simply assumed they would continue as they always had. This admission, far from satisfying the assembled group, only deepened their perplexity. If even the Reverend did not possess detailed knowledge of the bell's history, who did? Someone must have made decisions, must have established responsibilities, must have known the full story. Old Mr. Pemberton, emboldened by the growing urgency of the discussion, offered another fragment of recollection. There had been, he insisted with greater certainty than he had shown that afternoon, a definite change in arrangement some years back. 10 years? 15? He could not be precise. But there had been a winter, a difficult winter, and something had happened. Someone had been ill, or perhaps had left the town. The details swam just beyond the reach of his memory, tantalising in their nearness, but ultimately inaccessible. Miss Clara Bennet, who had been listening to these exchanges with increasing interest, ventured a practical suggestion. Mr. Reed had been with the church for many years, had he not? Surely he would remember the circumstances of any changes to the bell-ringing arrangements. Perhaps if several people were to ask him together rather than individually, he might feel more inclined to provide a complete account. This proposal met with immediate approval from several quarters, though the Reverend Glynn looked distinctly uncomfortable with the notion of what amounted to a collective interrogation of his caretaker. He began to counsel patience, to suggest that perhaps the morning would bring clarity, that there was no need to press the matter so forcefully on Christmas Day. But Mrs. Ellaway, her determination now fully engaged, would not be dissuaded. If Mr. Reed possessed information that would resolve the day's mystery, then surely it was his duty to provide it. They were not demanding anything unreasonable, merely seeking clarity about their own church's traditions. The group, now numbering perhaps a dozen of the more persistent parishioners, moved as one toward the churchyard, where Mr. Reed could be seen extinguishing the lamps that had illuminated the path during the evening service. He worked with his usual methodical care, seeming oblivious to the approach of the delegation until they were nearly upon him. Mrs. Ellaway, assuming the role of spokeswoman by virtue of her natural authority and her unwillingness to allow anyone else to claim it, addressed Mr. Reed with elaborate courtesy that thinly veiled her determination. They had some questions, she explained, about the bells and their history. Given that he had served the church so faithfully for so many years, he would surely be able to provide information that seemed strangely absent from collective memory. Mr. Reed regarded the assembled group with an expression of such mild attentiveness that it was impossible to determine whether he was surprised, amused, or entirely unmoved by their sudden attention. He allowed Mrs. Ellaway to complete her inquiry without interruption, then stood for a moment in apparent consideration of how best to respond. The bells, he said finally in his quiet voice, had their own story. It was not perhaps a story that could be told in fragments or half measures. Such things required time and proper understanding. This response, which might have been calculated to frustrate, was delivered with such gentle sincerity that it had the opposite effect. The urgency that had driven the group to confront Mr. Reed seemed to dissolve in the face of his patient dignity. Even Mrs. Ellaway found her certainty wavering. There was something in his manner that suggested not evasion, but rather a kind of careful stewardship, as though he were guarding something that required protection not from malice, but from hasty judgment. The Reverend Glynn, seizing upon this moment of softened determination, suggested that perhaps after the holiday had passed, when minds were less occupied with celebration and more receptive to serious reflection, there might be an opportunity for fuller discussion. Mr. Reed need not feel pressed to explain everything at once, particularly not on Christmas evening when he must be as weary as any of them from the day's activities. Mr. Reed inclined his head in acknowledgement of this reprieve, though his expression suggested neither relief nor gratitude, merely acceptance of what had been offered. He would be happy to discuss the matter at a more suitable time, he said, when proper attention could be given to what deserved proper attention. The group dispersed gradually, their curiosity unsatisfied, but their immediate urgency blunted. They departed in pairs and small clusters. Their conversations now turned to speculation about what Mr. Reed's fuller story might contain, what revelations awaited proper telling. Miss Amelia Ellaway, walking home with her mother, remarked that Mr. Reed's manner suggested someone carrying a burden that had been borne so long it had become almost comfortable in its familiarity. Her mother, less inclined to romantic interpretation, responded that the man was simply being difficult. Yet even as she spoke, Mrs. Ellaway found herself wondering whether her daughter might possess some insight that her own practical nature had overlooked. In his cottage, Mr. Reed sat once more at his small table, this time without the pretence of eating. The lamp cast shadows that moved gently with the flicker of its flame. He sat very still, his hands folded before him, his gaze directed toward nothing in particular, his thoughts travelling pathways known only to himself. Outside, the Christmas day that had begun too quietly drew toward its close. The stars emerged in a sky swept clear by the day's cold wind. The town settled into its houses, into warmth and family and the completion of cherished traditions, and in the bell tower of St. Barnabas the great bells hung silent, waiting for whatever truth the morning might bring. Chapter 5. Explanations Offered. Kindly. Boxing Day arrived in Ashwick Green with that peculiar quality of anticlimax that invariably follows great festivals, as though the town itself required a day of recovery from the exertions of celebration. The shops reopened their doors with somewhat less enthusiasm than usual. The streets, so carefully swept and tidied for Christmas, bore the evidence of the previous day's activities in scattered bits of ribbon and the occasional fragment of decorative greenery that had escaped notice. The world seemed determined to return to its ordinary rhythms, yet the question of the silent bells persisted like an ache that refuses to be entirely dismissed. It was on this morning that Mrs. Ellaway, whose determination had been reinforced rather than diminished by the previous evening's inconclusive exchange, decided that if Mr. Reed would not volunteer a complete explanation, then it became necessary to seek understanding through other channels. She recalled that Mr. Harold Sykes, a gentleman of considerable local standing who had once served on the church board during what she vaguely remembered as a period of administrative reorganisation, might possess knowledge that would illuminate the present mystery. Mr. Sykes occupied a handsome house on the far end of the High Street, positioned at sufficient distance from the commercial establishments to suggest genteel retirement, while remaining close enough to town affairs to maintain awareness of all significant developments. He was a man of perhaps 65 years, possessed of that combination of practical wisdom and careful conservatism that makes for effective management of parish matters. His hair had retreated from his forehead in dignified fashion, and his waistcoat, while not ostentatious, suggested a man who took proper pride in his appearance without descending into vanity. Mrs. Ellaway, accompanied by her daughter for propriety and by her sister for moral support, called upon Mr. Sykes on the pretext of delivering seasonal greetings, while harbouring the rather transparent intention of extracting information. Mr. Sykes received them with the courtesy of one who recognised the true purpose of their visit, but was too well bred to acknowledge it directly. He ushered them into his sitting room, where a fire burned with the methodical steadiness that characterised all aspects of his household, and rang for tea with the confidence of one whose servants could be relied upon to respond with appropriate efficiency. The initial conversation proceeded along the expected channels of seasonal pleasantries and observations about the weather, which had turned somewhat milder overnight, though still maintaining that crispness which reminds one that winter retains firm possession of the calendar. Mrs. Ellaway navigated these preliminary exchanges with practised ease, waiting for the proper moment to introduce the subject that had motivated their call. That moment arrived with the tea, which was served by a maid whose movements suggested long training in the art of being present without becoming noticeable. Once the cups had been distributed and the proprieties observed, Mrs. Ellaway ventured to remark that Christmas Day had been marked by an unusual occurrence, or rather by an unusual absence, regarding the church bells. Mr. Sikes set down his teacup with careful precision, his expression shifting to one of thoughtful consideration. He had noticed, he admitted, that the bells had not rung. He had assumed some mechanical difficulty, though he confessed to being somewhat surprised that such a difficulty had not been promptly remedied. Mr. Restrained was generally most reliable in attending to such matters. Mrs. Ellaway, seizing upon this opening, explained that the situation appeared more complex than simple mechanical failure. There seemed to be, she suggested delicately, some history regarding the bells that had become obscured over time. Given Mr. Sikes's long association with church affairs, she wondered whether he might be able to provide some clarification. Mr. Sikes was silent for a long moment, his gaze directed toward the fire, as though seeking guidance in its flames. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of careful selection, as though he were navigating terrain that required diplomatic attention. There had been changes, he acknowledged, in the arrangements regarding the bells. This had occurred during his tenure on the church board, though he was no longer certain of the exact year. The previous system, he explained, had relied upon a dedicated bell ringer who lived in a cottage near the churchyard. However, certain difficulties had arisen that made it necessary to reconsider these arrangements. What difficulties? Mrs. Ellaway inquired with the directness that was her hallmark in pursuing information she deemed important. Mr. Sikes appeared uncomfortable with the question, though he maintained his composure with the practiced ease of one accustomed to managing delicate conversations. The bell ringer, whose name he said had quite escaped his memory, though he was certain it had been perfectly ordinary, had encountered some personal difficulties. Health matters, perhaps, or possibly some question of reliability. The board had felt it prudent to simplify the arrangements, to consolidate the responsibility for the bells with the general caretaking duties that Mr. Reed performed so admirably. Miss Amelia, who had been listening with close attention, ventured to ask whether the previous bell ringer had agreed with this reorganization. Mr. Sikes's momentary hesitation provided more information than his eventual words. The man had left Ashwick Green, he said, shortly after the change was implemented. There had been no conflict, he insisted, no unpleasantness. These things were simply a matter of practical management. The board had acted in what they believed to be the best interests of the church and the community. Mrs. Bramley, whose nervous disposition made her particularly sensitive to undercurrents of emotion, remarked that it seemed a pity if someone had been displaced from a position they had held. Mr. Sikes assured her that every consideration had been given to the man's situation. There had been a discussion, he recalled, about some form of compensation or alternative arrangement, though he could not now remember precisely what had been decided. These matters, he observed with a touch of defensiveness, had occurred some years ago, and the details naturally became less distinct with the passage of time. The conversation moved to other topics, but the essential information had been extracted, even if it raised more questions than it answered. As the ladies took their leave, Mrs. Ellaway's expression suggested satisfaction at having obtained confirmation of her suspicions, while Miss Amelia appeared troubled by what had been revealed, or more precisely, by what had been carefully avoided in the revelation. Their next call was upon Miss Clara Bennet, whose family, though relative newcomers to Ashwick Green, had benefited considerably from the patronage of various established families. Miss Bennet received them in the modest but comfortable drawing-room of her family's house, her manner displaying that combination of genuine warmth and careful deference that characterized those who remained conscious of their still developing position in local society. Miss Bennet confessed immediately that her knowledge of church history was limited by her family's recent arrival. However, she recalled that when they had first settled in Ashwick Green, the cottage that had stood near the churchyard had been vacant. Her father had briefly considered purchasing it for conversion to a rental property, but the church board had ultimately decided to demolish the structure and use the land for an expansion of the cemetery. This had been presented as a progressive measure, making more efficient use of available space. The cottage, Miss Amelia inquired with careful casualness, had been the bell ringer's residence. Miss Bennet believed so, though she could not speak with certainty. There had been some mention of a previous occupant, but her family had not inquired deeply into such matters, being more concerned with establishing themselves than with investigating the past. The pattern that emerged from these visits was one of comfortable rationalization. Each person they consulted offered explanations that, taken individually, seemed perfectly reasonable. Practical management, efficient use of resources, the natural evolution of arrangements over time. Yet collectively, these explanations formed a narrative that was suspiciously smooth, as though rough edges had been deliberately filed away to create a more comfortable story. By the time Mrs. Ellaway and her companions returned to their own homes, they possessed considerably more information than they had held that morning. Yet this information, rather than providing clarity, had only deepened the mystery. Something had happened, some decision had been made, that had resulted in the departure of the previous bell ringer and the consolidation of his duties under Mr. Reed's quiet stewardship. And that something, while presented as merely practical, clearly carried a weight of meaning that no one seemed willing to acknowledge directly. Mrs. Ellaway, settling into her chair with the air of one who has completed a significant morning's work, remarked to her daughter that the truth of the matter was clearly more complicated than anyone wished to admit. Miss Amelia, gazing thoughtfully out the window toward the distant church spire, responded that perhaps the silence of the bells was Mr. Reed's way of insisting that complications could not be indefinitely ignored. Her mother, who prided herself on understanding practical matters but found herself somewhat at sea when confronted with symbolic gestures, made no reply, yet she too found her gaze drawn to the church spire, and to the tower where the bells remained as silent as they had been since Christmas morning began. Chapter 6. What the Silence Allowed. The days that followed Boxing Day settled into that peculiar interval between Christmas and the New Year, when time seems to lose its usual urgency, when the world pauses between one year's conclusion and another's commencement. In Ashwick Green, however, this customary lull was marked by an undercurrent of restless speculation that refused to subside into comfortable dormancy. The mystery of the silent bells had taken root in the collective consciousness of the town, and like all mysteries that touch upon matters of communal memory and shared responsibility, it grew more compelling the longer it remained unresolved. Mr. Reed continued his duties with unaltered consistency, moving through the churchyard and the church building with his habitual quiet efficiency. Yet those who observed him now did so with altered perception. Where once his presence had been so unremarkable as to be nearly invisible, it now seemed weighted with significance. His every action invited interpretation. When he paused in his work to gaze toward the bell tower, as he did several times each day, observers wondered what thoughts occupied his mind during these moments of apparent contemplation. When he spoke to parishioners who ventured to engage him in conversation, his mild responses were analysed for hidden meaning. He gave them little to work with, it must be said. His manner remained precisely as it had always been, courteous without being warm, helpful without being ingratiating, present without being intrusive. He answered questions put to him directly, but volunteered nothing beyond what was specifically requested. This studied neutrality, which had once seemed merely the natural disposition of a modest man, now appeared almost deliberate in its restraint. What Mr. Reed did in the privacy of his cottage during the long winter evenings was to remember. Memory, that curious faculty which allows us to revisit times and places long past, had become his evening companion. He sat in his chair by the modest fire, the lamp burning low to conserve oil, and allowed his thoughts to travel backward through the years to a time when his position in Ashwick Green had been considerably less established, when he had been merely a young man grateful for employment and uncertain of his place in the world. He remembered conversations overheard in the churchyard, snippets of discussion that had not been intended for his ears, but which he had been unable to avoid. He recalled the church board meetings from which he had been excluded, but whose outcomes he had witnessed in the alterations they produced. Most particularly, he remembered the winter that old Mr. Pemberton's fragmentary recollections had touched upon, though his own memory retained details that the old gentleman's mind had mercifully allowed to fade. It had been a winter of exceptional severity, he recalled, when the cold seemed to penetrate stone and mortar with invasive persistence, when even the well-prepared found themselves struggling against the season's harshness. The bell-ringer, whose name Marie had not forgotten, though others claimed to have done so, had been a man of advancing years and diminishing strength. His name had been Joseph Wickham, and he had rung the bells of St. Barnabas for more than 30 years, his reliability so complete that the townspeople had long since ceased to think of the bells ringing as a human action requiring human effort. Mr. Wickham had fallen ill that winter, as Mr. Reed remembered with perfect clarity. Not catastrophically so, not with the dramatic suddenness that compels immediate attention, but with the gradual decline that afflicts those whose constitution has been worn down by time and circumstance. He had continued his duties as long as he was able, climbing the tower stairs with increasing difficulty, pulling the bell ropes with hands that trembled from weakness as much as from the effort required. Mr. Reed, then a young man recently arrived in Ashwick Green and employed in various odd capacities about the church, had offered assistance. He had climbed the tower stairs beside Mr. Wickham on several occasions, ready to lend support should it be needed. He had listened to the older man's stories about the bells, about the particular rhythm each required, about the way the sound carried differently depending on the wind's direction and the season's quality. The church board, when they had finally taken notice of Mr. Wickham's declining capacity, had responded with what they undoubtedly considered practical wisdom. Rather than arrange for assistance, rather than modify the expectations placed upon the aging bell-ringer, they had concluded that the time had come to simplify arrangements. The position of bell-ringer, they determined, was an unnecessary expense when the duties could be absorbed into the general caretaking responsibilities. They would offer Mr. Wickham a modest pension, enough to maintain him in a modest comfort, and the bells would henceforth be rung by whoever happened to be serving as church caretaker. Mr. Reed remembered the meeting at which this decision had been conveyed to Mr. Wickham. He had not been present in the room, but he had been near enough to hear the tone if not the specific words of the exchange. He remembered Mr. Wickham's careful dignity as he had accepted the board's decision, his refusal to display the hurt that must have accompanied the knowledge that his 3 decades of faithful service were being concluded not through his own choice, but through administrative convenience. What had troubled Mr. Reed most profoundly, both then and in the years since, was the speed with which the decision had been accepted as inevitable by all concerned. There had been no public discussion, no acknowledgement that something of value was being lost along with the practical efficiency that was being gained. The pension had been arranged with satisfactory promptness, and Mr. Wickham had departed Ashwick Green within a fortnight, leaving no forwarding address and maintaining a silence that might have been interpreted as contentment had anyone troubled to inquire deeply enough to discover it was nothing of the sort. The cottage where he had lived for 30 years had stood empty for a time, gradually falling into disrepair through neglect. Eventually, as Miss Bennet had correctly recalled, it had been demolished and the land repurposed. The physical evidence of Mr. Wickham's long service had been erased as efficiently as the memory of his departure. Mr. Reed had been given the responsibility for the bells shortly thereafter, along with an increase in his wages that he had accepted with the silent understanding that he was being compensated for participating, however passively, in an arrangement that troubled his conscience. He had rung the bells faithfully for nearly 15 years, maintaining Mr. Wickham's traditions as best he could remember them, treating the task with the reverence he believed it deserved. And then, on this past Christmas morning, he had made the decision that the silence had been maintained long enough. Not the silence of the bells, which he had faithfully rung for all those years, but the deeper silence that the town had wrapped around Mr. Wickham's departure, the silence that had allowed everyone to forget what they had perhaps never truly acknowledged, that convenience had been valued above loyalty, that efficiency had been chosen over compassion, that a man's decades of service had been concluded without ceremony or proper recognition. The silence of the bells on Christmas morning was Mr. Reed's way of breaking that older, more significant silence. He had withheld the expected sound not as an act of protest precisely, but as an invitation to reflection. He had created an absence that could not be ignored, a gap in the familiar that forced attention toward what had been overlooked. He understood that this gesture might seem obscure to those who did not possess his knowledge of the past. He recognized that it might be interpreted as stubbornness or even as dereliction of duty. But he had carried the weight of his silent complicity for 15 years, and he had finally determined that Christmas, that season which calls us to examine our treatment of others, was the appropriate time to allow the past to speak through the present silence. Now, sitting in his cottage with his memories arranged before him like cards in a game of patience, Mr. Reed contemplated what would come next. The town was beginning to ask the right questions, to piece together the fragments of what had been deliberately obscured. Soon, he knew, someone would ask him directly about Mr. Wickham, and when that moment came, he would speak with the same careful honesty he brought to all his actions. But for now, the silence continued. The bells remained still, and in that stillness, the past waited to be properly acknowledged, to be given the recognition it had been denied for far too long. Outside, the winter darkness settled over Ashwick Green with the unhurried certainty of the season. In houses throughout the town, conversations continued about the mystery of the bells. Theories were proposed and dismissed, explanations were offered and found wanting, and in the church tower the great bells hung in patient expectation of the voice that would, when the proper moment arrived, ring them once again into sound and meaning. Chapter 7. A winter the town stepped around. The new year approached with its customary mixture of anticipation and apprehension, that peculiar state of mind in which we simultaneously look forward to fresh beginnings, while harbouring private doubts about our capacity to achieve them. In Ashwick Green, however, the approaching year carried an additional weight, for the mystery of the silent bells had ceased to be merely a curiosity, and had become instead a kind of mirror in which the town was being obliged to examine its own reflection, and finding that reflection less flattering than might have been comfortable. It was Miss Amelia Ellaway who finally succeeded in coaxing from old Mr. Pemberton a more complete account of the events that his fragmentary recollections had previously only suggested. She called upon him on a grey afternoon, when the light seemed to have difficulty penetrating the low clouds, and she brought with her a basket of preserved fruits from her mother's kitchen, for Mrs. Ellaway had learned long ago that information flowed most freely when accompanied by tangible expressions of goodwill. Mr. Pemberton received her in his sitting room, where the furniture seemed to have grown into its positions through decades of stationary occupation, and where every surface bore evidence of a long life lived among accumulated possessions. He was pleased by the attention, as elderly people often are when younger ones demonstrate interest in their recollections, and Miss Amelia possessed the gift of listening with genuine attention rather than mere politeness. She began obliquely, as was proper, inquiring after his health and commenting upon the weather, before gradually steering the conversation toward the subject of the church and its long history. Mr. Pemberton, who required little encouragement to embark upon reminiscence, spoke of various vicars and choirmasters, of church fetes and harvest festivals, of the changing rhythms that had marked his decades in Ashwick Green. When Miss Amelia mentioned the bells, Mr. Pemberton's manner shifted subtly. The easy flow of anecdote hesitated, as though encountering an obstacle it preferred to navigate around. But Miss Amelia, having come with purpose, gently persisted. She had heard, she said, that there had once been a dedicated bell-ringer, someone whose name had somehow been lost to common memory. Mr. Pemberton was silent for a long moment, his gaze directed toward the window where the grey afternoon light cast no shadows. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quality of reluctant honesty, as though he were confessing to a failure that still troubled him despite the passage of years. The man's name had been Joseph Wickham, he said, a good man, a reliable man, who had rung the bells of St. Barnabas for more years than most people could remember. He had lived simply in the small cottage near the churchyard, requiring little beyond his modest salary and the satisfaction of his work. The bells had been his responsibility and his pride, and he had attended to them with a devotion that exceeded mere duty. The winter Mr. Pemberton referred to had occurred some 15 years past, though he confessed that the exact year escaped his precise recollection. It had been a winter of exceptional hardship, when the cold seemed to settle into the very bones of the earth and refused to depart. Snow had fallen in November and remained, in drifts and patches, until late March. The roads had become treacherous, supplies had run low, the poor, already struggling, had found themselves in circumstances of genuine distress. Mr. Wickham, who must have been near 70 years of age by that time, had fallen ill. Not dramatically, Mr. Pemberton emphasised, as though this detail carried particular significance. There had been no sudden crisis, no alarming collapse that would have demanded immediate response. Rather, he had simply grown weaker, more fragile, less capable of managing the physical demands of his position. The church board had been faced with a decision, Mr. Pemberton explained, his voice taking on a defensive quality that suggested he was reciting arguments he had heard and perhaps accepted at the time. The winter was severe. Resources were stretched. There were many in the parish requiring assistance. The board had limited funds at their disposal, and difficult choices had to be made about their allocation. Miss Amelia, listening with the focused attention she brought to matters she deemed important, asked the question that seemed most essential. Had anyone offered to help Mr. Wickham? Had there been discussion of providing him with assistance to continue his duties until his health improved? Mr. Pemberton's discomfort deepened visibly. There had been discussion, he admitted. Various possibilities had been raised. Young Mr. Restrained, who was then employed in minor capacities about the church, had volunteered to assist, but the board, here Mr. Pemberton's voice grew quieter, had concluded that this would merely postpone an inevitable reckoning. Mr. Wickham was elderly. His health was declining. To continue his employment would simply be to delay what must eventually occur. The board had therefore determined that the most practical solution was to offer Mr. Wickham a modest pension and to consolidate his duties with those of the general caretaker. This arrangement would be, they had convinced themselves, in everyone's best interests. Mr. Wickham would be freed from the physical burden of his work. The church would benefit from more efficient management. The cost savings could be directed toward other needs. What had not been openly acknowledged, though Mr. Pemberton's manner suggested he had come to recognise it in the years since, was that this decision had been shaped less by concern for Mr. Wickham's welfare than by the board's desire to simplify their own responsibilities. The winter had been difficult. The demands upon the board had been numerous. Mr. Wickham's declining capacity had presented a problem at an inconvenient time, and the solution adopted had been the one that required the least ongoing attention. Miss Amelia asked whether Mr. Wickham had accepted this decision readily. Mr. Pemberton's expression suggested the question touched upon precisely the aspect of the matter that troubled him most profoundly. Mr. Wickham had been, he said carefully, very dignified about the entire affair. He had thanked the board for their consideration. He had accepted the pension they offered. He had raised no objection to the arrangement. But had he been happy about it? Miss Amelia pressed with gentle persistence. Mr. Pemberton met her gaze directly for the first time in several minutes. No, he admitted. The man had not been happy. He had been hurt, though he had been too proud to show it openly. He had given 3 decades of faithful service, and his reward had been to be told that his services were no longer required precisely at the moment when he most needed support. The cottage had been his home for all those years, Miss Amelia observed. What had become of it? Mr. Pemberton's shoulders sagged slightly, as though the weight of accumulated regret had become momentarily too heavy to bear upright. The cottage had been retained as part of Mr. Wickham's pension arrangement initially, he explained. He had been allowed to remain there for several months, but the upkeep had been expensive, and Mr. Wickham had eventually decided, or perhaps been encouraged to decide, that he would be more comfortable elsewhere. He had left Ashwick Green in the spring following that difficult winter, and he had not returned. The cottage had stood empty for a time, gradually deteriorating through lack of maintenance. Eventually the board had determined that demolition was the most sensible option. The land could be used for cemetery expansion, which was needed, and the cost of maintaining a building with no clear purpose could be eliminated. Miss Amelia sat in thoughtful silence, absorbing the full import of what she had been told. The story, as Mr. Pemberton had related it, was one of small failures accumulating into a larger wrong. No single decision had been obviously malicious. Each step had been defended, at the time, as reasonable and practical. Yet the sum of these reasonable decisions had been to cast aside a faithful servant when he most needed loyalty in return for the loyalty he had shown. And the town had allowed this to happen, she observed quietly, not as an accusation, but as a statement of simple fact. Everyone had known what was occurring, yet no one had objected with sufficient force to alter the outcome. Mr. Purcell Pemberton nodded slowly, his expression suggesting both agreement and discomfort with her characterization. It had been easier, he said, to accept the board's explanations, to trust that they knew best, to assume that everything had been handled appropriately. Only later, with the perspective that time provides, had he begun to question whether convenience had been allowed to masquerade as wisdom, whether the town had stepped around an uncomfortable truth rather than confronting it directly. Miss Amelia took her leave shortly thereafter, thanking Mr. Pemberton for his honesty and leaving him to his afternoon rest. As she walked home through the grey twilight, she found herself understanding at last the full significance of Mr. Reed's silent bells. He had been present throughout those events, a young man whose offer of assistance had been dismissed as impractical. He had watched a good man be cast aside, had witnessed the town's collective acquiescence to an injustice dressed in the language of necessity, and he had waited 15 years to ensure that the town did not forget entirely, to create a silence that would force remembrance upon those who had found forgetting more comfortable than acknowledgement. The church tower rose before her in the gathering darkness, its bells silent still, waiting for whatever resolution the truth might bring. Chapter 8. The Cost of Saying Nothing. The knowledge that Miss Amelia carried home from her visit with Mr. Pemberton spread through Ashwick Green with the peculiar velocity that attends truths which have long waited for acknowledgement. She did not, it must be said, engage in gossip or indiscriminate revelation. Rather, she spoke with careful discretion to her mother, who in turn shared the information with her sister, and from these initial tellings the story radiated outward through the interconnected networks of family and friendship that constitute the invisible architecture of small-town life. What distinguished this telling from previous speculation was its completeness and its moral clarity. The comfortable explanations that had been offered in recent days, the reasonable-sounding justifications that had allowed the town to avoid uncomfortable self-examination, were revealed as the evasions they had always been. Joseph Wickham had not left Ashwick Green because of vague, personal difficulties or convenient timing. He had been dismissed, however, politely, after 3 decades of faithful service, and the town had chosen to accept this dismissal without protest because protest would have been inconvenient. The revelation produced varied responses among those who received it. Some, particularly those who had served on the church board during that period or who had supported the decision at the time, responded with defensive justification. The circumstances had been difficult, they insisted. The choice had seemed reasonable given the constraints they faced. One could not, with the comfortable perspective of 15 years' distance, fairly judge decisions made under pressure. Others, however, received the information with a growing sense of shame that was made more acute by the recognition that they had, in their own ways, participated in the collective forgetting. They had allowed Mr. Wickham to become nameless, to fade from memory, to be erased from the town story as efficiently as his cottage had been erased from the landscape. They had accepted the simplified narrative because it required nothing of them, no examination of conscience, no acknowledgement of complicity. Mrs. Ellaway, whose natural inclination toward decisive action had been somewhat paralysed by the complexity of the situation, found herself in the unusual position of uncertainty. She had not been directly involved in the church board's decision 15 years prior, but she recognised with uncomfortable clarity that she had been present in the town, had been aware of Mr. Wickham's departure, and had asked no questions about the circumstances. She had simply accepted the change as one accepts changes generally, assuming that those in authority had acted appropriately. The realisation that this assumption had been misplaced troubled her more than she cared to admit. Mrs. Ellaway prided herself on her moral clarity, on her abilities to distinguish right from wrong with satisfying precision. Yet here was a situation in which she had failed to exercise that clarity, had allowed convenience to substitute for curiosity, had permitted a wrong to occur through the simple expedient of not inquiring too closely into matters that did not directly concern her. Her daughter, observing her mother's unusual quietness, ventured to suggest that perhaps they had all learned something of value from Mr. Reed's silent teaching. He had found a way, through the withholding of an expected sound, to make them attend to what they had chosen not to see. Mrs. Ellaway considered this observation with the seriousness it deserved. Yes, she said finally, but at what cost to himself? For 15 years he had carried the knowledge of what had occurred, had rung the bells in Mr. Wickham's place, while bearing the weight of understanding that his position existed because another man's loyalty had been repaid with dismissal. That was no light burden to carry in silence. The true cost of Mr. Reed's quiet endurance began to emerge more fully as the townspeople reconsidered his actions over the past 15 years through the lens of their new understanding. His unfailing reliability, which they'd simply taken for granted, now appeared as a form of penance, a daily reminder to himself of the injustice he had witnessed and been powerless to prevent. His modest lifestyle, which had seemed merely the natural preference of a man of simple tastes, might instead have been shaped by an unwillingness to prosper from circumstances he found morally troubling. The Reverend Glynn, when the full story finally reached him through multiple tellings that had achieved remarkable consistency in their essential details, experienced a crisis of conscience that manifested in his request that Mr. Reed call upon him at the vicarage. This meeting, which took place on the last day of the old year, was witnessed by no one save the two participants, but its effects would ripple outward through the days that followed. What passed between them could only be inferred from their subsequent actions and from the few words that the Reverend shared with his wife afterward. He had asked Mr. Reed, the Reverend explained to her that evening, why he had waited so long to bring the matter to light. Why had he not spoken 15 years ago, when his voice might have made a difference? Mr. Reed's response had been delivered with his characteristic quiet dignity. He had been young then, he had said, and uncertain of his standing. He had not believed his objections would carry weight against the collective judgment of the church board. Moreover, he had needed the employment they offered, had been in no position to sacrifice his livelihood for the sake of protest that might well have been ineffective. But why speak now, the Reverend had pressed, through this particular method? Why not simply come forward with the story directly? Because, Mr. Reed had replied, the silence of the bells on Christmas morning had accomplished what his words alone never could. It had created a space where curiosity could grow, where questions could be asked, where the truth could emerge not as accusation but as collective discovery. He had not wished to stand as an accuser, pointing fingers at individuals who had acted according to their understanding at the time. He had wished instead to create an opening through which the town might examine its own conscience and arrive at its own conclusions. The Reverend, relating this conversation to his wife, confessed that he had been humbled by Mr. Reed's patience and by the careful thought that had shaped his actions. The man had borne a moral burden in silence for 15 years, had watched the town forget what he believed should be remembered, and had finally found a way to prompt remembrance that invited reflection rather than defensiveness. The Reverend's wife, a woman of practical wisdom who often saw clearly what her husband's gentler, nature-obscured, observed that Mr. Reed had also paid a considerable price for his method. He had made himself the object of intense scrutiny, had risked his position and his standing in the community, had exposed himself to criticism and misunderstanding. That required courage of a particularly quiet sort. Her husband agreed, and added that it also required something perhaps more difficult than courage. It required hope. Hope that the town, when confronted with its own history, would choose acknowledgement over continued evasion. Hope that people, given the opportunity to do better, would seize that opportunity. Hope that silence, when properly deployed, could speak more eloquently than words. As the final day of the year drew toward its close, as Ashwick Green prepared for the customary observances that mark time's passage from one chapter to the next, the townspeople found themselves in possession of a truth they could no longer ignore. They had failed Joseph Wickham 15 years. Egut had allowed expediency to triumph over loyalty, had permitted a good man to be cast aside when he most needed their support. The question that now pressed upon them, with an urgency that no amount of rationalization could diminish, was what they intended to do with this knowledge. The past could not be altered, but the present offered opportunities for acknowledgement, for apology, for whatever forms of restitution remained possible. And at the centre of this communal reckoning stood Mr. Reed, no longer invisible, no longer overlooked, but revealed at last as what he had always been, a man of quiet conscience who had found the courage to remind his neighbours that some silences speak louder than any sound, and that the cost of saying nothing when something needs to be said is a price too high for any community to pay indefinitely. The church bells remained silent still, waiting for the moment when their voice would be welcomed not merely as familiar sound, but as the expression of a truth properly acknowledged and a wrong, however belatedly, addressed. Chapter 9. A Truth Found in Stillness. The first day of the new year arrived in Ashwick Green with that curious mixture of solemnity and hope that attends all such transitions, when we pause to reflect upon what has passed and to contemplate what might yet come. The morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of winter day when the air itself seems to possess a quality of crystalline purity, as though the world has been washed clean in preparation for its fresh beginning. It was on this morning that Mrs. Ellaway, after considerable thought and consultation with her daughter, decided that the time had come for direct conversity rather than continued speculation. She sent word to Mr. Reed, through the entirely proper channel of a written note delivered by her housekeeper, requesting that he call upon her at his earliest convenience. She extended a similar invitation to the Reverend Glynn, suggesting that the matter of the bells might benefit from collective discussion among those most centrally concerned. The meeting convened in Mrs. Ellaway's parlour that afternoon, when the brief winter sunlight cast long shadows across the carefully arranged furniture, and the fire burned with the steady warmth that characterises well-managed households. Mrs. Ellaway had positioned the chairs to suggest conversation rather than confrontation, and she had ensured that tea would be available, for she had learned through long experience that difficult discussions proceeded more smoothly when accompanied by the civilizing influence of proper refreshment. Mr. Reed arrived punctually, dressed in his customary neat but modest attire, his manner displaying neither apprehension nor defensiveness. The Reverend Glynn followed shortly after, his expression suggesting both pastoral concern and personal uncertainty about what the afternoon might bring. Mrs. Ellaway's daughter and sister were also present, for Mrs. Ellaway had determined that this was not a matter for private resolution, but rather one that required witnesses who might carry forward whatever understanding emerged. Once the tea had been poured and the initial courtesies observed, Mrs. Ellaway addressed the gathering with the directness that was her hallmark when she believed circumstances demanded clarity. They had all, she said, become aware of what had occurred 15 years previous regarding Mr. Joseph Wickham and the bells of St. Barnabas. They understood now why the bells had remained silent on Christmas morning. What they required, she suggested gently, was to hear the full account from Mr. Reed himself, in his own words, so that understanding might be complete rather than fragmentary. Mr. Reed set down his teacup with careful precision his movements unhurried despite the weight of attention now directed toward him. When he spoke, his voice carried its customary quiet steadiness, but underlying that steadiness was a quality of relief, as though he were finally permitted to set down a burden he had carried overlong. He began not with the events of 15 years ago, but with his arrival in Ashwick Green as a young man seeking employment and a place where he might establish himself in the world. He had found both at St. Barnabas, he explained, through the kindness of Mr. Wickham, who had noticed his presence in the churchyard and had inquired whether he sought work. Mr. Wickham had spoken to the church board on his behalf, had vouched for his character though they were barely acquainted, and had helped him secure the position that had sustained him ever since. This debt of gratitude, Mr. Reed explained, had shaped everything that followed. When Mr. Wickham had fallen ill during that harsh winter, Mr. Reed had offered assistance not merely out of Christian charity, but out of personal loyalty to a man who had shown him unexpected kindness. He had climbed the tower stairs beside Mr. Wickham, had learned the particular technique required for each bell, had listened stories about the decades of Christmas mornings and Easter celebrations and Sunday services that the older man had marked with faithful sound. The Reverend Glynn, listening with the focused attention of one hearing details previously unknown to him, asked quietly whether Mr. Wickham had expressed concerns about his ability to continue his duties. Mr. Reed considered the question with the thoughtfulness it deserved. Mr. Wickham had been a proud man, he said, not in the sense of vanity, but in the sense of taking proper pride in work well done. He had acknowledged his declining strength, but he had hoped, that with assistance he might continue in his position until his health either improved or until the natural conclusion of his working years arrived. He had wished to retire on his own terms, with dignity rather than to be told that his services were no longer required. But the church board had decided otherwise, Mrs. Ellaway observed, her tone carrying no accusation, merely stating what they all now understood to be fact. Mr. Reed inclined his head in acknowledgement. The board had made what they believed to be a practical decision, he said. He did not doubt that they had convinced themselves they were acting reasonably, but in their rush to solve an administrative inconvenience, they had failed to recognise the human cost of their efficiency. Mrs. Bramley, who had been listening with increasing emotion, ventured to ask whether Mr. Wickham had been bitter about his dismissal. Mr. Reed's expression softened with something that might have been sadness or might have been admiration. Mr. Wickham had been many things, he said, but bitter was not among them. Hurt, certainly. Disappointed, without question. But he had maintained his dignity throughout, had accepted the pension offered to him, had thanked the board for their consideration, even as he must have felt the sting of their rejection. He had left Ashwick Green quietly, without complaint, without drawing attention to the injustice of his treatment. And that silence, Miss Amelia observed with sudden insight, was what Mr. Reed had been unable to accept. The town had been allowed to forget because Mr. Wickham himself had made forgetting easy through his dignified restraint. Mr. Reed met her gaze directly, and for the first time since the conversation began, something approaching warmth entered his expression. Yes, he said simply. That was precisely what he could not permit to continue. Mr. Wickham's grace in accepting his dismissal had enabled the town to move forward without examining its own conscience. His silence had been taken as consent, his departure as confirmation that the board's decision had been correct. The Reverend Glynn, whose pastoral sensibility had been deeply troubled by the entire affair, asked what Mr. Reed hoped might result from bringing the matter to light after so many years. Mr. Reed was quiet for a long moment, appearing to gather his thoughts with the same careful attention he brought to all his tasks. He hoped, he said finally, that Ashwick Green might acknowledge what had occurred. Not to assign blame to specific individuals, for those who had served on the board 15 years ago had acted according to their understanding at the time, however flawed that understanding might have been. Rather, he hoped the town might recognise the pattern of thinking that had allowed the wrong to occur, the elevation of convenience over compassion, the preference for administrative efficiency over human loyalty, the willingness to forget rather than to remember. More than this, he hoped that if similar circumstances arose in the future, The memory of Mr. Wickham might serve as a reminder to choose differently, to value faithfulness over expediency, to recognise that people are not merely functions to be managed, but individuals whose dignity deserves protection, even when, especially when, protecting that dignity proves inconvenient. Mrs. Ellaway, whose eyes had grown suspiciously bright during Mr. Reed's recounting, drew herself up with the decisiveness that signalled her arrival at a resolution. Then she declared, Ashwick Green must find a way to acknowledge this debt and to make what amends remained possible. Mr. Wickham must be remembered properly. His service must be recognised, and if he yet lived, he must be told that the town understood its failure and regretted it deeply. The Reverend Glynn agreed without hesitation. He would write to Mr. Wickham immediately, he said, if his direction could be discovered. He would offer the apology that should have been offered 15 years ago. He would extend whatever invitation to return, even briefly, that Mr. Wickham might be willing to accept. And the bells, Mrs. Bramley asked, her voice tentative but hopeful, would they ring again? Mr. Reed's expression transformed into something that, while not quite a smile, suggested the lifting of a weight, long carried. The bells would ring, he said, when the town had properly acknowledged what had been left unacknowledged, when truth had been spoken and heard, when remembrance had replaced forgetting. The gathering concluded shortly thereafter, but not before Mrs. Ellaway had extracted from both the Reverend and Mr. Reed a promise to work together in determining what specific actions might constitute proper acknowledgement. As the participants departed, each carrying away their own reflections on what had been revealed and what might yet be done, the afternoon light faded gently into evening, and the New Year's first day drew toward its peaceful close. In the bell tower of St. Barnabas, the great bells hung in their customary silence, but it was a silence now understood, a silence that had spoken its truth and waited only for that truth to be answered with appropriate action. Chapter 10. When Voices Returned Gently. The actions that followed the New Year's Day gathering proceeded with a deliberation that was itself a form of respect, an acknowledgement that matters of conscience cannot be rushed but must rather be allowed to unfold at the pace that dignity requires. The Reverend Glynn undertook the task of locating Mr. Joseph Wickham, with the thorough attention of one who recognised that this search represented not merely administrative necessity, but moral obligation. It transpired, after inquiries directed through various ecclesiastical channels and the assistance of parish records from neighbouring districts, that Mr. Wickham had settled in a coastal village some 40 miles distant, where he lived in modest circumstances with his widowed sister. He was now approaching his 85th year, and though his health had declined, as must be expected at such an age, he retained, according to those who knew him, the quiet dignity that had characterised his earlier years. The Reverend composed his letter with painstaking care, drafting and redrafting the words until they expressed what needed expressing, without excess or insufficiency. He wrote of the town's belated recognition of the injustice done to Mr. Wickham 15 years previous. He acknowledged that no apology could restore lost time or erase hurt long carried. Yet he hoped that Mr. Wickham might find some measure of comfort in knowing that his faithful service had not been forgotten, that his dignity in accepting an undeserved dismissal had finally prompted the examination of conscience it had always warranted, and that Ashwick Green wished to offer whatever recognition and restitution remained possible after so long a silence. The response, when it arrived some 2 weeks later, was written in a hand that trembled slightly but remained legible, suggesting a man whose physical strength might be diminished but whose faculties remained clear. Mr. Wickham expressed surprise at hearing from St. Barnabas after so many years. He acknowledged that his departure from Ashwick Green had been painful, though he had endeavoured not to harbour bitterness. He had found a new life in his sister's village, simpler than what he had known but not without its satisfactions. He was gratified to learn that his years of service had not been entirely forgotten, and he accepted the town's apology with the same grace he had displayed in accepting his original dismissal. As to returning to Ashwick Green, even briefly, Mr. Wickham expressed doubt that his health would permit the journey. However, he included in his letter a request that had clearly been important to him. He asked that his name be remembered when the bells rang, not in any grand or public fashion, but simply in the private knowledge that someone still recalled the decades he had devoted to their care. This letter was shared among those most closely involved in the matter, and its contents produced a profound effect upon all who read it. The absence of recrimination, the gentle acceptance, the modest request for simple remembrance served to deepen rather than diminish the town's sense of what had been lost when Mr. Wickham had been allowed to depart without proper acknowledgment. Mrs. Ellaway, in consultation with the Reverend Glynn and with Mr. Reed's quiet input, proposed a series of actions that would constitute the town's formal response. A letter would be sent to Mr. Wickham's sister, enclosing a sum of money that represented not compensation, which could never be adequate, but rather a tangible expression of respect and regret. A plaque would be commissioned for placement in the church, recognising Mr. Wickham's 3 decades of faithful service as bell ringer of St. Barnabas. And most significantly, a portion of each Christmas offering would henceforth be designated for the support of those who had served the church faithfully, ensuring that future generations would not repeat the mistake of valuing efficiency above loyalty. These measures were presented to the congregation on the second Sunday of the new year, not through any lengthy sermon or elaborate explanation, but through the Reverend's simple recounting of what had occurred and what the town proposed to do in response. The telling was received in profound silence, a silence quite different from that which had marked Christmas morning. This was the silence of recognition, of shame acknowledged and responsibility accepted. When the Reverend concluded by asking whether the congregation supported these proposed actions, the response was immediate and unanimous. More than this, several parishioners rose to add their own suggestions: a bench in the churchyard bearing Mr. Wickham's name, a contribution toward his comfort in his final years, the inclusion of his story in the church's written history so that future generations might understand what their predecessors had learned at such cost.